Hello and welcome. More Russian infighting amidst heavy losses sustained by both sides. This and more in this situation report. Colonel General Mikhail Teplinsky was replaced by Lieutenant General Oleg Makarevich as the commander of the VDV, the air assault groups. Military bloggers are outraged because of this, the pro-Russian military bloggers, because Teplinsky has made his career inside of the VDV. He has combat experience, and they call Makarevich an academic without any connection to the VDV. So in this regard, he would be foreign to what they are supposed to do and what is going to happen there. The reason for that is obviously not fully clear, but it seems that there was, before him being relieved of his command, or at least replaced in his command, there was some kind of fight from Teplinsky, the former commander of the VDV, with Gerasimov, among which the VDV was supposed to be used as infantry, as regular infantry in the Donbass, and supposedly Teplinsky was opposing this. This would obviously mean that special forces with special training are being used in a meat grinder, suffering heavy losses, and Teplinsky was apparently against that. It's unclear now whether that led to Teplinsky basically retiring, saying that he's quitting, or whether he was released after that fight in this regard. But still, it shows that the developments inside of the Russian government and inside of the Russian military are are changing fast. At the same time, the military bloggers are increasingly becoming a faction inside of the Russian military sphere that are opposing the regular army with their regular structures. Gerasimov might have made the choice to use the VDV as ground infantry because they have proven, or likely proven, to be highly successful in this role around Soledar, but that would mean heavy losses. But with Gerasimov now personally commanding the invasion of Ukraine, he has to deliver success by all means, whether that eats up the VDV or not. Generally, this shows us what we are going to see, that the fracturing of the Russian military will continuing, the fracturing among the infighting among the certain groups that obviously don't just include the Russian general armed forces, but also Wagner and other paramilitary groups. According to estimates by both the US and Norwegian military intelligence, Russian losses have now reached 188,000 men. Both sides, Norway and US, published those numbers, and that would mean that roughly 50,000 Russians have fallen if you regularly assume that there are roughly 3 wounded to every single one who has fallen. And while in the northern area from Belarus, we have some news as well. There are continuing reports of Russian units being moved out of Belarus, likely after completing their training to get ready to get involved in the fight here inside of Ukraine. But at the same time, there are still Russian troops moving into Belarus, and overall the number that is being moved into Belarus seems to be significantly higher than what is moving out. So either the training is being intensified, or the Russians are deliberately creating a buildup of forces on the northern border of Ukraine in this regard. When it comes to the northern border, there was some events too in Sumy. In Sumy Oblast, the Ukrainians report that there was a ground incursion from Russia into Ukraine, but in total it was a group of six soldiers, supposedly for sabotage or recon mission, and the Ukrainian response to that drove them back into Russia. But we have crossing over the border in this region, and again basically showing the Ukrainians that they have to continue guarding the whole front line and can't redeploy their forces otherwise. On the Eastern Front, the fighting is continuing. Heavy fighting is continuing, but mostly without changes. So the Ukrainians are fairly close to Crimea. They have crept closer, but not much has changed. On both sides, there are attacks happening without any proven change in control, but we have one video from Novoselivske, which was recently reported liberated. Then there were reports of a Russian counterattack happening there. And what we see here now are 2 Russian tanks in Novoselivske that are driving there and then shooting at Ukrainian positions. So at the very least, Novoselivske, or basically what we can read out of this, is that Novoselivske is still contested. Obviously, if they shoot at something, then that must mean that Ukrainians are still in there. And we now have visual proof that the Russians are also in there. So Novoselivske is contested and not liberated, or at least no longer liberated for the Ukrainian side. South of the Seversky Donetsk, the fighting is continuing with high intensity, but the changes in control of the territory are slowing down. While the fighting is more or less intense along the whole front line, its focus is still around Bakhmut. We have reports that Krasnopolivka has now fallen. This is here north of Soledar, and thus obviously advancing closer to in the direction of Seversk and endangering that salient here further east of this line. Also, there are continuing battles for Krasnahora. It seems that the Russians have advanced a little bit into this, which would lead them closer to the lines of communication here into Bakhmut, which is one of the 2 big remaining lines of communication for Bakhmut, where the Russians are now creeping closer and closer. At the same time, the Russians have advanced south of Bakhmut and have likely advanced somewhat in the direction of Yahinde. No, Yahinde, there are attacks. Sorry, my mistake. Yahinde, there are also attacks, not just from Krasnohora, but also from Pitorodne in the direction of Yahinde, clearly aimed at cutting the northern line of communication. South of it, we have reports of some Russian advances in the direction of Ivanivske. This is here, and now we are obviously reaching a point where an encirclement of Bakhmut is coming closer. Both attacks in the north as well as in the south are clearly meant to encircle Bakhmut. Bakhmut itself is still under attack. There are still ground assaults on the eastern and southern part of the city, where the Russians at times even advance into the city, but the majority of the big focus of the Russian offensive activity seems to be focused on encircling Bakhmut. Should Ivanivske or Yahidne be reached, or that road here more or less, I don't see any way to avoid a Ukrainian withdrawal from Bakhmut. And as we can see, the Russians are still advancing very slowly, but they are advancing at both those main lines of communication, where reaching one of them will likely force the Ukrainians to withdraw and give up Bakhmut to the Russians in this regard. Further south, we have continued attacks around Avdiivka, no confirmed change in territory here, and we have heavy attacks in Marinka. There are reports that the Russians try to bypass Marinka in the south in the direction of Pobieda, but I have not confirmation that they have achieved anything, that they advanced in this direction in any way. And there was also a recon attack in the direction of Velika Novosilka, up here, supposedly defeated by the Ukrainians, no change in territory here as well. There are continuing attacks in Zaporizhzhia by the Russians as well. The Russians claim they've captured 12 towns by now. That's coming from Kamyansk further east, more or less close to Orikhiv. Along that along that whole line, they are claiming they have captured anything. We have no confirmation whatsoever, neither by the Ukrainians, where they inadvertently often confirm Russian advances by saying that they shelled Russians in a certain town or something like this. We don't have anything like this. I have not seen any image proof either that they have actually advanced in those directions. But if there were successes, then it's likely attributed to the weak Ukrainian positions in that area, that the long lull in fighting has led to both sides weakening their frontline positions, which are then obviously opening up opportunities for a sudden attack to push the opponent somewhat back. That does not have to mean that we are going to face a serious Russian offensive north in the direction of Zaporizhzhia city itself and in the northern part of the oblast, even though obviously it's too early to say that the momentum the Russians are currently trying to build up is not going to carry them further. But as said, most analysts I've found, most analysis I've read are interpreting this. If the Russians have gained some ground here, then it was opportunistic, where they found weak Ukrainian positions they could brush aside. That this is not meant to be the second or a second big offensive next to the one around Bakhmut. As said, we have no confirmation whatsoever that they gained much in that they gained some grounds, but there seemed to be that they gained a little bit in the direction of Novodanilivka. That seems likely. When it comes to the towns west of here, no proof whatsoever. Starting from Kamyanske to the towns further east, I have not seen any proof of this, but it seems likely that they have at least advanced into some Ukrainian frontlines positions. And at this point, I can also show you a video where I have to say it's from the from a Russian propaganda channel, but it still illustrates the current developments along the front line. The heavy losses occurred by the Ukrainians. This is supposedly a graveyard in Kharkiv showing the recent losses, and you can see that after the initial graves, it's all makeshift graves, and you see, for instance, Kraken unit here, you see an Azerbaijani flag, you see different units being displayed here with their fallen. And I show you this video because I found some informations about the current losses of not just the Russians, where the US and the Norwegians said 188,000 have died, have been casualties, but also when it comes to the losses that the Ukrainians have suffered, and they are vastly differentiating in the size of it. When it comes to the battle for Soledar, I found two publications, two points, two different sources claiming different losses. One source claimed that the Ukrainian losses are light, no comparison to the Russians, and that the Ukrainians are happy with the Russian attacks because the frontal attacks are bleeding out the Russian offensive potential, and they are basically, they are bleeding themselves white. The other one is claiming that Ukraine alone, in Soledar alone, has lost 14 battalions. Now, obviously, what means lost? You could interpret it's down to the last man. Everyone is dead or wounded. Even if we take a generally small size of a battalion, that would mean 7,000 men wounded or lost just around Soledar, which seems massively overblown. And then again, like a battalion lost is unlikely to have died or been wounded to the very last man. But that's the biggest number. So we have massive differences in the claims of the Ukrainian losses, even though it must be understood that the Ukrainian losses are substantial. So far, as said, there are some claims the Ukrainians allow the Russians to push them back slowly with frontal attacks because the Russians are suffering such tremendous losses, but we can probably expect the truce to be somewhere in the middle, that the Ukrainians suffer significant losses but not devastating losses yet. But there is one issue still with the situation, that is that Russia was mostly using Wagner people for the attacks there, and those are completely expendable to the Russian side, as they are paramilitary forces, mostly convicts, which basically are, if you want to say it cynically, are a burden to society anyways. So if they fall, it's a gain for the society. Please excuse that cynical point of view, but in this regard, losing Wagner people is not that big of a deal for the Russian armed forces and for the Russian state. On the other hand, the Ukrainians were using around Bakhmut elite units of their armed forces, from the presidential guards to several others high-value, well-renowned units that were there, while they were rotating a lot to prevent high losses, extremely high losses, and the attrition of complete units. Obviously, every man falling in those units, in experienced units, elite units, is much harder to replace than Russian convicts at the same time. Generally, though, we have to say that if for Ukraine the loss of Soledar and Bakhmut will not be is not considered such an immense catastrophe that they have to hold it by all means. We see the signs that the Ukrainians are not deploying their reserves. They are not filling up losses on the front line by pushing more in. They are still rotating through, deliberately keeping their front lines weaker than they could by not rotating, by letting the soldiers longer on the front line, which would obviously have devastating long-term effects. But they are still accepting the fact that by preserving units, they might lose some territory, which is obviously not being considered dramatic. Behind Bakhmut and Solidar, we can see a lot of elevations. So to defend the front line here in the direction of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk should well be within the realm of possibility. It offers good positions even outside of the towns. So being pushed back is not the biggest issue for the Ukrainians itself. Still, though, we have to admit openly that it is impossible for us right now to judge how much of the losses how big the losses are that the Ukrainians have suffered there, and at the same time how much of the lost territory was basically a deliberate falling back while bleeding the Russians white, or how much of it was simply forced by the strength of the Russian attacks. So while the loss of Bakhmut and Soledar should not be a drama for the Ukrainian side, we are massively affected by the fog of war here that doesn't allow us to really judge to what degree the Ukrainian forces are being weakened here, even though we can see that the Ukrainians do their best to maintain the integrity and the fighting capability of their units, for example, by rotating them through massively all the time. When it comes to the mobilization, to the question of mobilization and force generation, we have the news that Ukraine is still not doing another mobilization wave because they think that the troops they are currently having are enough to hold back the Russians, including the freshly raised reservists. Obviously, we need to understand this. Just because Ukraine calls for general mobilization, and has potentially several million men in fighting age available, doesn't necessarily mean that even in a war for its existence, it can or should recruit everyone and try to put him in uniform, because obviously those units have to be trained, they have to be equipped, they need competent command, which would not be available for millions of fighters. And at the same time, the Ukrainian economy still needs farmers, still needs workers in the background, etc., etc. So every man being called up to the armed forces now might help along the front line, but the Ukrainian government needs to judge the necessity for additional soldiers against the burden any soldier in uniform does to the state coffers and to the state economy and to the supply and equipment for the soldiers, etc. In this regard, so far, Ukraine does not go all in. Surprisingly enough, if you think about it, the situation along the front line here again, Ukraine is showing a remarkable restraint. As I've said in the past, when we haven't seen Ukrainian reserves for months along the front line, where they were, while the Ukrainians were being pushed back, they still kept their reserves ready for a potential strike that, for instance, we saw from Balaklia in the direction of Kupiansk. Whether Ukraine, though, will be able to keep that they don't recruit, that they don't do another mobilization wave. I also reported here on the channel that they didn't call up the conscripts for the autumn cycle in 2022. Another sign that they consider to have enough troops, that they judge that they currently have enough troops. Whether they will be able to keep that up is increasingly unlikely, though, as this war has now turned into an attritional battle to a certain degree, at least in Donbass, where the front lines are only slowly moving and the mass of infantry and artillery being used causes high losses among the Ukrainians. And if the Russians are continuing their frontal human wave attacks, more or less, if they're continuing losing high numbers, and if they continue doing this after Wagner has more or less been expended, if they continue this with the reserves, then Ukraine will have no choice but to raise additional forces as well to make up for the losses they are obviously suffering and that they are obviously enduring during those attacks. Generally, on the Russian side, there's also mobilization happening. We are still waiting for the proclamation of a second wave of mobilization, even though I said in the past that it's possible too, that the Russians are still doing a crypto mobilization, that they don't publicly announce it, but basically every day hand out a couple of call-up notes in every office. But what Russia does do is the mobilization of workforces. In Omsk, for instance, it's now being published that they introduced a 6 month training program that reduces the usual training period of 2 years for potential workers for the armament industries down to 6 months. Another sign that Russia is more or less turning its economy increasingly into a wartime economy, now reducing the training periods to have a higher availability of workers for defense production in the short run. Generally, we can see that Russia is clearly preparing for a long war and is mobilizing for it, which means that even should Ukraine give in now with the political capital expended already, it is unlikely that Russia would stop with only Ukraine being defeated. We should expect that Russia would continue at the very least into Moldova and probably into other of its neighboring countries as well. When it comes to the political sphere, we have Prigozhin continuing to work on his public image. He now published a letter from a fallen Wagner mercenary where local forces have refused to take care of the funeral proceedings. A family member had written to Prigozhin thanking him that he took care of it and actually quoting that he is the only person who took the fate of the defenders of Russia serious. So he's presenting himself as the glorious, honorable man who is the one taking care of the defenders of Russia while the local authorities don't do it. At another publication, he said that after in Sverdlovsk, the honorable burial of a fallen Wagner mercenary was refused, that he will take care of the scum that was responsible for it and will take their children by the nose and pull them into the war in Ukraine, so to force them to participate. By this way, he's obviously showing that he's a man of the people and that he's addressing a big issue within Russia, that the elites are obviously avoiding a direct involvement in the war. You have probably also heard about the story where opposition figures had called the son of Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, calling him up for military service, and he was like panicked and said, "Don't you know who I am, who my father is?" in a way, assuming that he of course will be spared to have to go to the front lines because he's the son of someone important. So by Prigozhin basically addressing this openly and attacking it openly, he makes he creates the impression that he's a man of the people and he's the one who is not going to allow the elites to get away with having only the pleb fighting for them and fighting and dying. Also, he was in Solidar, showing that he's on the front line, that Solidar is captured, and there he took a propaganda video of him overseeing the placement of Ukrainian fallen soldiers in coffins with the exclamation that he'll send 20 trucks filled with Ukrainian fallens to the Ukrainian side. Obviously, then again, presenting himself as the honorable man who even allows the opponent a burial of honorable burial of their fallen. So he's the man with the knightly manners, with honor and everything, and presenting the Russian armed forces in contrast to that, and the Russian authorities as somebody who doesn't see the world like himself and is less honorable. In the political sphere, we have something from Zaporizhzhia as well. The Ukrainian head of the oblast, Alexander Staruksh, said that the so-called evacuations of civilians in parts are only simulated because in reality they would lock them into cellars, into basements. This is meant for propaganda and intimidation. I can't really say whether that is supposed to be in connection with fighting partisans, or whatever the point of claiming they are evacuated and then actually locking them in should be. But it's without saying that the claim by the Ukrainian Oblast head is currently completely out of our reach to actually check on how much of it is true at this very point. When it comes to the international support, there are claims now, they aren't fully confirmed, that the German government will not stand in the way when others are going to deliver Leopard 2. From what I've seen, it's mostly relying on Annalena Baerbock, who is the foreign minister, but we need to understand that she's from the Green Party, who are advocating weapon deliveries for quite some time, and that she's, as a foreign minister, is not the person to decide whether or not tanks are going to be delivered. So at the moment of the recording, I have not seen any confirmation that the German government will actually allow the delivery of Leopard 2s, mostly from Poland and Finland, but also from other countries, to Ukraine. Still though, Poland, while we are already there, Poland has promised to deliver equipment for 1 brigade. So that should be 30 to 40 T-72 and roughly 100 BMP-1s. And the interesting thing is we have a video, an article from the Russian Pravda, which is actually writing very positively about the Swedish CV9040 that are going to be delivered, 50 of those to Ukraine. And they actually seem to be kind of afraid of the vehicle. They say they praise the ammunition, says how much it can penetrate, and clearly say like at 1,500 meters they can still penetrate 120 millimeter of armor. And as I've said in the past, that means that the Russian, even the most modern Russian tanks, they even mention here those as well. So T-72 B3M, T-80 BVM and T-90M, all of them can basically be destroyed at over a kilometer when they are attacked from the side by this IFV, which has a very powerful 40 millimeter gun, and in the current fighting, obviously putting one of those IFVs into an ambush and then having it use its autocannon at over a kilometer to destroy tanks is well within the realm of possibility. So the Russians seem to be actually having a lot of respect for the Swedish CV9040 and to be almost afraid of it, because the protection level of the CV90 is also higher than that of many other IFVs in its own class. Also, we have news in an interview. François Macron said that he is not, I saw it in AFP, that the French government does not rule out the delivery of Leclerc main battle tanks. France only has a limited amount of them available. I tried to find it a while ago already, how many of those are in reserve, so would be available for that as well, but it's more or less the same as with the Challengers. They might be able to scrape together 50 to maybe even 100, but that's fairly unlikely. We are more likely to see maybe a dozen, 2 or 3 dozen at the most, but still France is not ruling out delivering its own main battle tank to Ukraine. And in total, so far at Ramstein, the Ukrainians were promised 170, roughly all rough numbers, 170 MBT, 190 artillery pieces, 880 APCs, and 500 IFVs. All of this is more or less the half of the number of what Salushny said in an interview a while ago that is necessary to reconquer all the territory that was lost since the 24th of February 2022. Generally, we are already coming to a close here. So now it's up to you. What do you think? How long will Ukraine be able to hold the front lines here along Bakhmut? And do you think when the Ukrainians decide to evacuate, will that lead to a collapse along the front line here along in the Donbass? This can obviously lead to highly interesting discussions, and it helps a lot with the algorithm, as does hitting the like button if you enjoyed the video. And if you want to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. This channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you, so thank you very much to everyone already supporting it. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.